San Bruno, California is a suburban city near San Francisco. Recent news events include a shooting inside the Tanforan shopping mall in 2019 and a shooting outside YouTube headquarters in 2018. But for today, we are going to go back to the 1930s. While this true crime story hit like an earthquake in its day, it's possible the police investigation may have purposely overlooked uncomfortable questions about power and privilege. Please bear with the many details of this story because this may be one of the most curious investigations into a murder that you are likely to hear. On Saturday night, February 20th, 1938, Mrs. Dolores Fisher Smith, 55, wife of eminent physician and civic leader Dr. Frank Holmes Smith, 58, became worried over her husband's long absence at an appointment with a female patient, Mrs. Helen Cornell, 27. Dr. Smith was seen that day at Mills Memorial Hospital in San Mateo, and then he drove to his appointment, arriving at 6:30 p.m. The evening hour of the appointment was unusual to begin with, but Mrs. Cornell had to work during the day. As far as could be gathered, Dr. Smith first treated Mrs. Cornell for a hurt elbow sustained by a fall while horseback riding in Wyoming 2 years prior. The doctor's wife did not have far to go to check in on her husband, since his office was in a small bungalow next to their home at 475 San Mateo Avenue in San Bruno. Mrs. Smith had only been home herself for 2 days after being hospitalized for bronchial pneumonia. In the home with her was the doctor's brother, Harry B. Smith, famous sports writer for the San Francisco Chronicle. Had either the doctor's wife or the doctor's brother been able to hear anything unusual coming from the doctor's office that night, it was ruled out due to Mrs. Smith being deaf and Harry B. Smith being asleep. It was later learned that at some point during the 3-hour appointment, the patient's husband, Elliot C. Cornell, local carpenter, drove by the doctor's office on his way home from seeing a movie in South San Francisco. Unlike the doctor's napping brother, Mrs. Smith was wide awake for the duration of the appointment and could see the doctor's office lights on and his car outside. She became increasingly alarmed as the appointment with the young Mrs. Cornell passed its 3rd hour. So at 9:30 p.m., she went over to check in on her husband. Upon entering the bungalow, she was suddenly met with a scene of abject horror. Lying on the floor of the small consulting room with his head near a couch was Dr. Smith, groaning in pain in a pool of blood. Lying on the floor near him was the patient with her head in a pool of blood in the doorway, dead. The police were soon on the scene, and Dr. Smith was rushed to Mills Hospital in an attempt to save his life. Apparently overcome, the sickly and hearing-impaired Mrs. Smith was also brought back to Mills Hospital that night and admitted as a patient. Every crime scene tells a tale in regards to the placement of bodies and a murder weapon, and this one was no different. However, descriptions varied in the press during the next few days. We're told Dr. Smith was shot from behind by a .38 caliber revolver found at the scene, the bullet entering the skull at the right base, passing through his head and lodging near the top of a cabinet at one side of the consulting room. Reports vary on his degree of consciousness. Most say he never regained consciousness, while one says that upon arriving at the hospital, he regained consciousness sufficiently enough to be able to speak a few words to the treating physician. Apparently the physician, Dr. A.O. Shanky, was not fully informed of the situation back at the doctor's office, and therefore asked Dr. Smith, "Had anyone else been there?" Dr. Smith, apparently suffering memory loss, replied, "I don't know." Either that, or Dr. Shanky was asking if there was a third person, and Dr. Smith, shot from behind, really didn't know. And then at one point, Dr. Smith said in a panic, "Let's get out of here. Hurry, let's get out of here." Despite the best efforts to save him, he died at 3 a.m. Regarding Mrs. Cornell, again, reports of her injury and placement of the gun used in the shooting varied. On Sunday, the press reported that her body lay nearby to Dr. Smith with a gun in her hand. On Monday, there were more details in regards to her injury and the placement of the gun. In one, it was reported that she had been shot through the head and the revolver lay beneath her body. In other descriptions, the gun was either in her hand or lying beside her left hand or under her left hand. Regarding her body, one reported that she was found dead, a bullet hole over her right eye, while another stated the woman had shot herself through the temple just above the left eye. From the outset, it was believed the shooting was a case of murder and suicide. Of course, there may have been whispers in the community while a motive was sought. After all, when the newspapers broke the story, they referred to Mrs. Cornell as the doctor's beautiful young patient. People knew then, as we do now, that some professional men, doctors, lawyers, ministers, and professors, etc., sometimes have affairs with women they are in close contact with. And while less PC to acknowledge, sometimes it happens that a woman patient finds a male doctor whom she has bared body and soul to very attractive and falls in love with him. Be that as it may, police did not have the answers, but they were not about to even consider the respected Dr. F. Holmes Smith was involved in anything but a professional relationship with a patient unhappy with her medical care or who was deranged. After all, this is a man who not only held down his own practice, but through the years supervised the county's milk inspection department, held elected office, was the Tanforan horse racing track physician, was a mason, and who had been called upon to rush to the hospital at all hours to respond to victims of serious injuries brought about by car accidents and even beatings by rum runners during Prohibition. What's more, he and his wife had been married since 1911, and they raised a son together who himself was off at medical college. Owing to his status in the community and his shocking murder, on Monday, hundreds of people jammed near his funeral parlor in San Bruno for his funeral. So many, in fact, that the crowd overflowed into the street. The service was held under the auspices of the Sir Francis Drake Masonic Lodge, number 376 of South San Francisco. The papers reported that in another room of the same mortuary lay another body, that of lovely 27-year-old Mrs. Helen Cornell. In the room stood only one person, her husband Elliot, who was still to be re-questioned by police over remaining mysteries of the double shooting. The next day, Mrs. Cornell's funeral was held. Once again, the chapel was as crowded as the funeral the day before. Dr. Smith was buried at Olivet Memorial Park, and Mrs. Cornell was buried at Cypress Lawn Memorial Park. The police investigation was headed by San Bruno Chief of Police William Maher and Deputy District Attorney Burris Carmel. The gun itself was brought to San Francisco and was studied by police expert Francis X. Ladalupe. Unfortunately, the gun was so covered in oil that not a single fingerprint could be found on it. Now many a gun has been wiped, or thrown into water, or fired by someone wearing gloves, but it's unusual to hear of a gun that covered in oil at a crime scene. However, another test proved positive. Ladalupe was successful in applying the paraffin test to Mrs. Cornell's dead hand, which showed by chemical reaction tiny blue telltale spots that proved her hand had recently fired a gun. That was enough for the police. She was the shooter. Though for my part, I would not have thought it as open and shut as that, especially since on the night of the double shooting, it was learned Elliot Cornell, the husband, admitted buying the gun only 2 or 3 days before, but could not say why he had bought it, let alone why his wife had used it. Perhaps he was too upset to answer questions, or perhaps he felt the answers would put himself in a bad light, or even his wife's memory in a bad light. He was excused, but would soon cough it up, for better or worse, as to whether his forthcoming statements were truthful or not. In the meantime, and I mean in the very meantime, since the investigation lasted but a few days, the main, or should I say only focus of the investigation was on what could be learned about Mrs. Cornell. Her medical records at the doctor's office were scoured, but this did not prove helpful since he did not keep records on most of his visits with patients. They speculated Mrs. Cornell was dissatisfied with her medical treatment, but upon sitting down with the police chief again, Mr. Cornell said she never complained about her treatment. Well then, Elliot, what about the gun? Can you tell us why you bought it so recently? This time he had a reason. He told them he bought it for protection. It was all very innocent. He and his wife were planning on going on a hunting and camping trip, and they needed it for protection. Okay, but then things got weird. The police learned that at the San Francisco advertising agency where Mrs. Cornell was employed as a stenographer, she was known as Mildred Little, said to be her maiden name, and none of her associates knew she was married. What about that? We can imagine the chief saying. And as shocking or foolish or unbelievable as this may be, when questioned as to Elliot Cornell's past life with his wife, he was unable to recall details as to when or where they were married. At this point, it would seem the investigation has gone off the rails and we have an uncooperative witness. But this was 1938, and I can tell you that the police would begin to employ certain methods to get the so-called husband to talk. I'm not saying it was with violence. This was San Bruno, not Chicago, which had more of a reputation for that sort of thing. But they could threaten to make his life difficult and hold him as an accessory or co-conspirator to murder if he didn't play ball. The papers, of course, do not say they leaned on him, but if I've seen it once, I've seen it 100 times. When suddenly a suspect or an associate out of nowhere with no explanation starts remembering things in a different way. Mr. Cornell was no different. He explained that 2 years prior, in July 1936, his wife was thrown from a horse in Wyoming and developed osteomyelitis, a painful bone infection in her elbow. That was why she was initially treated by Dr. Smith. But then he revealed some other aspects of his wife's health, and it was all very troubling. He stated that she suffered from spells of melancholia and had threatened suicide a number of times. And as ridiculous as it may sound, he had given her the gun in the belief it would dissuade her from her constant talk of suicide. He said that when she had talked of jumping off the Golden Gate Bridge, he had taken her for a walk on the span, and the sight of the distance to the water had caused her to promise she would forget her thoughts of leaping from the span. He claimed she subsequently insisted on having a gun, and he thought the sight and feel of the weapon would be another piece of, as he put it, applied psychology to change her mind about suicide. Let's stop here for a moment. We have to ask ourselves if he is making all this up. Do the police have any other witness statements to support the husband's claims that his wife was apparently mentally ill? In fact, they did. On the afternoon of the murder, Dr. Smith told a colleague at Mills Memorial Hospital, Dr. James F. Reinhardt, that he had an appointment that evening with a woman who I think is a mental case. Another acquaintance of the doctor, this one at a San Bruno drugstore, said that Dr. Smith told him that he had an appointment that night with an insane woman. If all this was so, what was driving Mrs. Cornell insane? Mr. Cornell was asked if he thought the pain from her elbow caused her to murder the doctor and then turn the gun on herself. He said he did not believe that, and that she had too much courage, so much so that despite the pain, she kept on at her work as a stenographer and typist, although on occasion she was only able to use one hand. The only thing that he seemed to be able to offer, aside from her being suicidal, was that she had been eating lightly in an attempt to lose weight. Despite these answers, the chief kept looking for witness accounts to substantiate his theory that Mrs. Cornell was insane at the time of the shooting. He said he had been informed that on the morning of the incident, she had been in a highly nervous condition and had made numerous purchases at drugstores here of preparations to relieve the pain in her arm. But with this statement came contradictions, because to another reporter, he said he learned that Mrs. Cornell had recently been purchasing opiates to quiet her nerves instead of to relieve the pain of an elbow injury, as was first supposed. Deputy District Attorney Burris Carmel stated that Mrs. Cornell apparently had not been troubled with the elbow injury since early the year before. Yet even as the two investigators sought to confirm that Mrs. Cornell was not being seen by Dr. Smith for pain, a day later, one of the papers reported that an unnamed woman was said to have heard Mrs. Cornell say, "I'll kill that doctor if he doesn't cure my arm." This alleged statement was most likely fed to the paper by someone before Chief Maher had a chance to pull it back, since he was obviously changing his mind about the pain angle that was not supported by the investigation at that point. But he still needed to make sense of what happened and support the statements previously released concerning her suicidal ideation, as well as Dr. Smith allegedly, and oddly enough to speak in such direct terms, telling associates that he had an appointment with an insane woman. Somehow authorities were informed that Mrs. Cornell had been on a strict diet and had been taking steam baths in an attempt to reduce her weight. Revelations that Mrs. Cornell had been taking thyroid granular extract since early in October the year before were made by Chief Maher. In so many words, the papers reported, efforts to lose weight may have caused mental instability, which may have prompted attractive Mrs. Helen Cornell to slay Dr. F. Holmes Smith and then end her own life, was seen today by San Mateo County authorities. Yet, despite the few records from her visits with Dr. Smith, the last entry on Mrs. Cornell was that she was seen for a throat treatment in November, while the doctor's nurse stated she thought the patient's last visit was in January. The book was nearly closed. While the stunning news about the thyroid tablets was relayed through the news media, Coroner William Crosby awaited the report from Dr. Joseph Swim, San Francisco pathologist, of an examination of Mrs. Cornell's stomach to determine whether she had taken some drug, no doubt since Chief Maher declared she had been seeking opiates for her nerves. Coroner Crosby had also asked Dr. James F. Reinhardt, San Mateo autopsy surgeon, to test Mrs. Cornell's blood. 1 week after the deaths, it was reported by Coroner Crosby that the report of the autopsy of Mrs. Cornell failed to shed any new light on the double shooting. Dr. Reinhardt stated that her death was caused by a gunshot wound. Other than the effects of the wound, Mrs. Cornell was normal physically. The report on the blood test was still awaited, but it was probably normal or inconclusive, since on March 1st, 1938, the inquest verdict of murder and suicide was in, and testimony failed to reveal the motive that prompted Mrs. Cornell to shoot the physician in his office February 19th and then end her life, although evidence was given supporting the theory that it was due to mental instability caused by rigorous efforts to reduce by taking excessive quantities of thyroid tablets. 10 days later, the city council granted permission to the Exchange Club to plant a double row of oak trees as a memorial to Dr. Smith on Genevieve Avenue between El Camino Real and San Mateo Avenue. A bronze plaque honoring Dr. Smith would be placed on one of the trees opposite his residence. On June 3, 1941, the doctor's wife, Mrs. Dolores Fisher Smith, died in Mills Memorial Hospital at age 58 after a brief illness, leaving an estate of $10,000 to $15,000 to her son. Her last rites were held at the same funeral home as her husband's and Mrs. Cornell's, yet she was not buried in the same cemetery of her husband, but rather Cypress Lawn, where Mrs. Cornell was buried. I don't know about you, but in terms of the investigation, I feel something is really amiss, and I have a number of questions. To the authorities, it was a clear case of a deranged, suicidal woman who pulled a gun on her doctor, shot him in the back of the head, and then shot herself in the temple. The public record placed the gun both in her hand and out of her hand, and placed her entry wound on either the right side temple or the left, and those discrepancies were never addressed. The paraffin test of Mrs. Cornell's hand was probably accurate, but it is interesting to note that less than 2 years later, during another county gun case which involved the apparent suicide or accidental shooting of a Hillsborough police officer, while Police Inspector Francis Ladalupe claimed the gun used in the shooting was positive for close-range powder burns, autopsy surgeon Dr. James Reinhardt was unable to find traces of powder in the face wound. No gunshot residue was found on the officer's hands, and no fingerprints were found on the gun. Owing to these strange facts, the coroner's jury returned an open verdict. The officer's family hired a private investigator to prove the shooting was a case of murder. As far as I can tell, it was never determined if it was a case of suicide, accidental shooting, or murder. To me, the most obvious unanswered question in the Helen Cornell case is, was the doctor having an affair with a patient? And would there be reason to cover it up? There was definitely a reason to cover up that sort of thing in those days when it came to prominent citizens. The thinking may have been thus: if one prominent doctor was messing around and taking advantage of his female patients, who else was? Yet even if he did, he didn't deserve to die for it. So really, why not spend every effort of the investigation delving into the physical and mental health of the young woman, while at the same time make zero inquiries into the life of the physician? To this end, publicly disclose alleged stories and statements about the woman, but not offer a single solitary statement about the physician. Again, why should there be any speculation ventured about Dr. Smith or the questioning of other female patients? By all accounts, he was a hard-working pillar of society, and even if he had had an affair with his patient, no one stated that he did on the record. So his fine memory should be maintained, and the woman was just crazy, and that is that. Well, I'll tell you why some questions should have been aired publicly. While none of the reports disclose how Dr. Smith was dressed when he was shot, it happens one newspaper reported how Mrs. Cornell was dressed. Mrs. Cornell was reported to have been wearing a $500 fur coat and an expensive diamond ring. Wait, what? How much was $500 in 1938 in contrast to 2019? $500 was worth over $8,700. That's some fur coat. Did she buy it and an expensive diamond ring herself? Anything is possible, but usually women did not. In 1930s America, fur coats and diamonds were seen as expensive tokens of affection, often bestowed upon a woman by a man who could afford them. Of course, maybe her husband or a wealthy great-aunt had given them to her, but why wear that type of glamorous coat to her appointment? Unless, could Dr. Smith have given it to her? Was any investigation made into this? One might speculate that she killed Dr. Smith because she was an opiate addict, and Dr. Smith would not prescribe to her. There doesn't seem to be anything more than a rumor that she sought opiates, which at first fit the murder and suicide over pain story, and then was turned around and made to fit the anxiety story, but then evidence positive for opiate use was not found in the autopsy report. If she really was pursuing painkillers, she would have sold her fur coat and diamond ring and her car before turning to murder and suicide. If she did have a bone infection in her elbow, why was the injury not mentioned in the autopsy report? There may have been physiological changes at the thin skin of the elbow and within the bone. After all, the authorities stated a day after her funeral that a woman heard another woman believed to be Mrs. Cornell say she would kill Dr. Smith if he didn't heal her elbow. Or was that just a plain false smear made in the early theory that she killed the doctor over her medical care? Why didn't the autopsy report mention if she was pregnant or not? I realize there is no need to mention a negative on just about any other condition a person doesn't have in an autopsy report, but did no one think to test her? The final inquest into the crime strongly believed that her attempt to lose weight figured into her mental state leading to her suicide. Who's to say she wasn't pregnant by the doctor or someone else, but was in denial and was fiercely trying to lose the weight brought on by a pregnancy? Or was she trying to miscarry by starving herself and taking excessive amounts of thyroid medication, which was in fact used by some in those days for weight loss, dangerous as that could be? If she was convinced she was pregnant by the doctor and that he wouldn't help other than provide long evening appointments, is that not an angle that should have been addressed? Her husband stated that on the night of the murder-suicide, they left in separate cars at the same time. If she was as suicidal as he claimed, why didn't he go to the appointment with her, at least to sit in the car outside waiting? Remember that Dr. Smith went to the appointment at 6:30 p.m. If she left for the appointment at the same time as her husband went to the movies, as he claimed, why didn't he stop when he drove by after the movie when he saw his wife's car was still there? Or did he stop, and did he have something to do with the murder and suicide by being suspicious of his wife still being at the appointment after he had been to the movies? Did the police ever follow up on his story about being to the movies by asking to see his ticket stub and questioning staff at the theater as to the time he arrived and the time he left? Authorities placed the shooting at about an hour before the bodies were discovered. Were the doctor and patient together for 2 hours, and isn't that about the time the husband would have been driving by on his return from the movies? Was a single statement made by Mr. Cornell ever corroborated by associates? On the night of the shooting, did the police make a search of the Cornells' home and vehicles? Was there a diary or any letters or a suicide note of any kind, as is often found when, for some period of time, an individual is threatening suicide? Were the hands of the three principal relatives checked for gunpowder residue? That is, Mrs. Smith, who discovered the bodies, Dr. Smith's brother, who was asleep in her house next door, and Mr. Cornell, who bought the gun he claimed was for his wife? Was the seller of the gun ever contacted to learn if either Mr. and Mrs. Cornell made any statements about the purchase? Why did he buy her a gun? Was he, as we have seen in recent cases, encouraging her to take her life? It's one thing to walk with her on the Golden Gate Bridge. He could have restrained her if she tried to jump. But did he really think if a suicidal person held a gun that they would never use it on themselves or others? Or was that all just a story aimed at establishing the suicidal ideation narrative? Was she in fact really suffering from depression of an unknown origin, or was she in love with her doctor and desperately seeking his help with something that she was extremely nervous over? Did the doctor see her for long 2-hour appointments and buy her expensive gifts, but would not leave his wife for her? Had she made an ultimatum, and had he tried to end the affair, breaking her heart? Why is it that not a single psychologist was consulted and given an opportunity to express a counterpoint to the chief's theories? I'm not saying the chief's job was easy, but on the other hand, why didn't he say, which he didn't, that they looked into the affair angle and found nothing? And if Dr. Smith really thought Mrs. Cornell was insane, why didn't he move to have her evaluated and committed to a mental health facility? We are faced with a mystery now as then. Either a woman had taken drastic measures to lose weight, leading to severe anxiety caused by an extreme hormonal imbalance, which was certainly possible as a result of excessive thyroid medication, killing herself and an innocent doctor in the process, or all that was true, as well as a romantic fixation on her doctor, who may or who may not have had an affair with her. We don't know what we don't know. Were the deaths extremely sad and wasteful? Yes. Should there have been a public inquiry that asked the difficult questions? I think so. Because 99 out of 100 times, a woman experiencing personal mental anguish does not take her doctor with her in death for no reason. And 99 out of 100 times, when a man buys a gun mere days before his wife is found shot dead with another man, he had something to do with it. In closing, let me state that normally in these old cases that I study, I do not find reason to question the statements made by the police regarding their position on the evidence and statements they claim were made by others. In the Cornell Smith case, however, I feel that obvious questions were not asked and that Chief Maher completely shaped the information released to the press, which of course can be argued as being his job, but the question is, was his job complete? I do not know if relevant information on Dr. Smith at the crime scene was held back by Chief Maher, nor why he released contradictory statements of opioid use by Mrs. Cornell, apparently not supported by her autopsy. If you are a rank-and-file police officer and feel his investigation should be supported on principle alone, let me apprise you of one later fact of history. In 1952, the San Mateo Times ran a story with the following headline: Bruno chief told to reform, force, or quit. Maher ordered to get along with cops or quit. It turns out there had been a lot of management problems on the force, so much so that Chief Maher was ordered by City Manager Matt K. Slankard to reform his department and get along with its personnel, or else he would be removed. One of the chief's most egregious wrongs was that he had ignored a hero cop when this officer returned to work after nearly losing his life while on duty as a result of being shot in the face, a 1946 story I hope to get to, by the way, for this program. With the support of the city council, the city manager ordered Chief Maher that the recovered officer, Sergeant James Bedford, be given full recognition as a police officer in the department and be given communications as other officers were. Being that Sergeant Bedford was given the first Top Achievement Award for heroism by the Peninsula Peace Officers Association in 1949, it seems the least Chief Maher could do is recognize Sergeant Bedford with full status as a human being and as an officer in good standing with opportunity to achieve higher rank, which is pretty hard to do when you are not accorded status by your chief. Rather than resign, Chief Maher told the city manager he would cooperate with the measures, though the new press regulation stating that there shall be cooperation between the chief and the press seemed nebulous at best, since the chief alone controlled press matters. Chief Maher retired on January 1st, 1962, and while he reminisced with the press over some old cases, he did not mention the Helen Cornell, Dr. F. Holmes Smith case. Thank you for listening. My public speaking skills are a little rusty. Feel free to leave your comments and hit the like button, which of course is not a like for the crime, but rather helps to bring in more listeners who are looking for this type of historical material, and whose comments on the subject may be helpful. Dr. Smith's oak trees and home are long gone, but he should be remembered for all his positive medical work in San Mateo County and the lives he saved. If Mrs. Cornell killed him and herself over excessive thyroid medication, it is hoped her story served as a warning to others not to overuse hormonal treatments and health supplements. The unintended physical and mental consequences can be terrible.